Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second session of Cityscripts 2024, an author conversation with Yuvan Aves on his book, Intertidal, A Coast and Marsh Diary, with journalist Preeti Zachariah. The book looks at diverse habitats and rich ecosystems along coastlines and marshlands. It's my pleasure to welcome our speakers. Yuvan is a writer, naturalist, educator, and activist based in Chennai. He loves working with children and educators and consults for a number of alternative educational institutions across India. He is the founder, managing trustee of Palluyir Trust for Nature Education and Research. His recent book is Intertidal, A Coast and Marsh Diary, published by Bloomsbury. He is also the author of 2 books on ecology and 3 children's books. Yuvan is a recipient of M. Krishnan Memorial Nature Writing Award and Sanctuary Asia Green Reacher Award, among others. Preeti works as an assistant editor with the Hindu's digital team and writes across topics including sustainability, culture, art, society, books, science, health, wildlife, and heritage. Yuvan will be signing books here after the session. Do get your copy signed. Over to you, Preeti.
Good evening. I'm really happy to be here today talking about this book. I read it for the second time, actually, just finished it yesterday. And I'm stunned by the sort of detail about wildlife and ecosystems that sort of this book encapsulated. You know, she talks about, how locusts are grasshoppers gone rogue. There's so many bees. There's so many insects in this book. I mean, I think that was what really stunned me, the amount of insect diversity in Madras. And that's a city I grew up in, so I haven't seen that many insects here. It's one of those form-defying books that I think everyone should read. It's just beautiful. So I think it would be nice to start with a bit from the book. So I'm going to ask you to read like a part of it.
Okay, hi everyone. I am so happy to be in this space, which is a place of reimagining cities in a 1,000 different ways, much more than what they are usually perceived as. Looking at cities in all their historical interstices to many kinds of movements. I was just walking around, looking at the maps and various representations, and I'm happy to be in conversation with you, Preeti, who was the very first journalist who was interested in covering this book for the Hindu. Thank you for that. Cities, interestingly, are perceived as largely human spaces, but one of the themes of this book is that they are hugely visibly and invisibly crafted by the non-human. And this passage which Preeti wants me to read is about the banyan tree. The banyan tree is a being of utter entanglement. When it's a fruit, it needs a specific wasp to get inside, pollinate it, because banyan fruits, ficus fruits, have their flowers inside. You can't see their flowers. Once they are out, their seeds need to go through the digestive systems of frugivorous birds. And then to actually grow, banyan people, bat fig, a number of them need to sit on a host, be on another tree, grow like an octopus on a palmyra or a neem, and then suffocate, kill them over 40 years, and then become a tree. Their lives are just so entangled with so many other things. And banyans are reshaping human spaces. And this passage is about that. And it starts in the middle of an entry. So in the morning, I sat on the balcony and watched for a while the people sapling growing from the railway station's pillar and the 3-foot banyan on its sunshade. Later, I walked into the unoccupied spaces of the station towers and noticed ficus roots cracking the withering cement under the station's terrace, running alongside the rusting steel bars. Think about where all you've seen banyan and people growing, other than on the ground, on pavements and on buildings and on other places. Yeah, some ficuses like banyan people and bat fig will never germinate on the ground. Koyal, oriole, myna, and other birds must eat their fruits and leave their seedy droppings on another tree. Then that ficus grows like an arboreal octopus into the host tree's trunks, sucking out their health, growing down, rooting into ground. Buildings too hold nutrients, brick, lime, and sand, which the ficus has learned to tap. A wet, mossy patch on a roof or a sunshade is ideal. Or just a sheer vertical wall. Steve Cutts, in his film Man, shows a dark post-human landscape of cement and skyscraper wastelands, lifeless and uninhabitable, upon which a lone white man sets his throne. It's a powerful image, but it may be wrong. A post-human world may well be a dense ficus forest forged from brick and concrete, planted by frugivorous birds, full of life, people included perhaps. On the weekend, Rohit, my friend, and I go around Old Madras to see the slow insurgence of ficus trees. Given 50 years in their space, they will climb over our monuments and dismantle them. They see no need for old British forts in the city. Might as well turn them into trees. Ficus roots are breaking open prison chambers and the armories at Fort St. George, cracking the corners and climbing out of its war moats. Old bungalows of merchants and zamindars and washerman pet are already 4-story forests. People roars out of French windows. Its roots run like and into plumbing. The central press's old colonial buildings are also run over. Invading banyans have been chopped off multiple times, but they've grown through the floors like veins, such that a new building has been built for the press to function. Parakeets and mynas fly out from branches inside Indo-Saracenic balconies. Tailor bird and Ashiprinia call from inside a warehouse. The apex towers of the High Court host ficus seedlings. One tree has knocked down the wall of an Amman temple built around it, and the place is enclosed in green sheets for renovation. Abandoned agraharams north of NSC Bose Road have huge bat fig and banyan breaking out of their tiled roofs. Temples, churches, mosques, any religion can be turned into bark, leaves, heartwood, and sapwood.
Thank you for that, Yuvan. That's a great bit of the book. This book is written in the form of a diary which spreads over 2 years, November 2020 to 2022. It's set in the Urur Alkot beach, and it sort of is, thank you. It's sort of a cyclical in terms of form itself. My question, Yuvan, is how did it begin? We chatted about it, and you said it began with the Pulicat protests, the issues. Could you talk about that and how it evolved into what it is today?
Yeah. The genesis of cities are hydrologies. And Chennai exists, for instance, Bangalore exists because of tributaries of the Kaveri. Everybody exists, all life exists within a watershed. And I think that's the most, essential part of any identity of any life form. And for Chennai, it is the Kosasthalaya River, which is a massive river coming into Chennai from the eastern Ghats, and then becoming like one massive python, going into the sea at a place called Yennur Creek, then not finding that sufficient, jutting in back again, hitting the sea again at a place called Karangali Estuary, not finding its flow accommodated enough, then comes out and then goes into this vast wetland called Pulicat Lagoon, which is India's second largest brackish water body. And the problem with cities is it's a fight between amnesia and a resistance and an abstinence from forgetting. One of the main threats Chennai faces is, hey, hello. Okay. One of the threats Chennai faces is a massive port built, being proposed by Mr. Adani. It's about 6,111 acres, built upon the Kosasthalaya River, the genesis of the city, and then which threatens to sort of erase Pulicat Lagoon. So I've been, among perhaps hundreds of other people involved in trying to evoke the importance of this space and its beauty and its fragility in public's consciousness, and the campaign has been going quite well. And so a lot of work has gone into that. We've made field guides. We've made an activity book called Seashells, which if teachers want to make the coast a learning space, they can do. About 15 schools are using it. And I've written a book called Shore Walk, which is again based on the coast. And Intertidal actually emerged from there, but then has its own branches. But the idea that to, in a very mainstream way, helping or rather facilitating, reminding people to belong to this place, which is, and its genesis hydrology. That's where it came from.
Where it came from. Can we also go into, I know you spoke about how when people ask you, what is this book about, the first time you were like, I don't know, because it's such a complex book with so many layers to it, But there are 4 or 5 very distinct themes which come out of this book. So could you maybe talk a bit about those 4 themes?
I was at a Lit Fest last year, and suddenly they asked me what the book is about. I was like, 10-second silence. And then after that, I prepared an answer, because then suddenly people ask like this, I'm like, it has sort of 4, it's a conscious effort to have written it like a diary, because a diary allows you to have a repeated, deepening engagement with the same space and place, and have an opportunity to uncover various, dimensions of it. I'm thinking about other diaries. Peregrine by J. Baker, extraordinary book. I'm thinking about The Forest Unseen by David George Haskell, where he takes a mandala on a forest floor and goes there for every day for a year. This is something like that. And it sort of weaves together 4 things. One is that observation of the non-human and the intermingling of the human and the non-human, and how that allows important portals of perception into one's own self, and also the nature of reality itself, interconnectedness, non-separation, other truths about beinghood, which various spiritualities talk about, but then it's so apparent and directly observable in a multi-species society, not as an idea, but actually. There is also the sort of constant thread of many branches of activism and the communities and the various people involved in that, fighting for wetlands and rivers and coasts. And then there is this practice of a nature educator constantly trying to bring children in public and say, hey, look at that insect. And say, hey, look at that. This is what the book sort of broadly weaves together. It's a bad description of it, but yes, no.
Let's talk about the title, mixed up. The title of the book, Intertidal, which is obviously this part of the shore which is uncovered during low tide and gets covered in high tide, which is the physical aspect of it. But it's also, there are a lot of metaphors embedded in the word intertidal. Could you go into it and how that shaped,
Yeah, you have explained it so well in your question itself. Intertidal is the sort of intervening space between high tide and low tide, which some of you in Bangalore may not be familiar with, but okay. Actually, all wetlands have tides, but then there are a few centimeters, so maybe you can watch that. But no, I'm not making fun of you. It is also an ecotone. In ecology, an ecotone is where one habitat meets another, and that intervening space is thriving with life. And it's also a very metaphoric, metaphysical space. It's places where clear boundaries are blurred and new beings inhabit. And that sort of, and often those boundaries are in the mind and arbitrarily imposed. for instance, in Chennai, and there are multiple intertidal spaces explored in the book, including human and non-human, self and other. What is this thing we call myself, But another important, very grounded sort of false binary, which perhaps in Bangalore very relevant, is land and water. Does not exist, especially in Chennai. Classification of something as land and something as water actually allows for all kinds of violence and invisibilization. There is no such thing as land and water in Chennai. There are, for instance, you look at all our lakes called traditionally eries. They have water for 3-4 months, maybe the large one 6 months. They go dry. They become grasslands, scrublands. They become grazing lands. Lot of marshlands, lot of estuarine areas are dry for most of the time. They look like land, but they are tidally influenced. Tides are extremely queering agents. So that's also another important false binary which the book sort of delves into and tries to muddle and complicate. Yeah.
There's a lot of liminality in that.
Yes.
I want to talk about the Palayu Trust and the work you do with nature education. What struck me about the book was, sorry, I wanted to talk about the Palayu Trust and the sort of work you do there. What struck me about the book was the sort of wonder. There's a childlike wonder in these little things. You're observing sweat bees, you're observing wasps. And as a nature educator, I think you've mentioned it in the book, where children are more open to the wonder, the magic of nature. And you've spoken about nature education changing their perception, their politics, their critical thinking. Could you go into the work there? And how do you think nature education can change the way a child looks at the world?
Pretty vast question. Okay, we run an organization called Palluir Trust. Palluir in Tamil means all of life. It comes from Thiruvalluvar's. Thiruvalluvar was a poet in Tamil, and he, I think, in his 321st Tirukkural. Hey, any Tamil speakers here in Tamil? Oh, nice. Oh, thank you. I feel less nervous. Okay. He said, Paguttundu Palluir Ombudal, Nulor Toguttavatril Ellam Thalai, which 2,500 years ago is a very radical thing to say. He said, to share and coexist with all of life is the essence of all our hoarded wisdom. Forget about everything else. The last thing he didn't say, I'm just adding. The inspiration of that word came from there. Palluir began because with Madras Naturalist Society, we started an internship in 4 colleges to train young people into powerful nature educators in Chennai who will ongoingly engage public. And what happened was, now it's into its 5th year of internships. And by the second internship, a lot of people, and one of the people who help run it is your teacher, when you were Kalpana, Professor Kalpana from Stella Maris College, came back and said, listen, this is all we want to do. We want to become nature educators. Can you help us? I don't know what you'll do. It's like, internship is over, go home, But, and then this was happening year on year for 2 years. And then I said, hey, okay, let's begin an organization. And see if we can have a strong, grounded practice of nature-based learning in Chennai, and we've been doing a bunch of stuff. Most recently, we have, I think, for the first time, if not one of the first times in India, studied how local nature-based learning impacts children's well-being in government schools in collaboration with the Greater Chennai Corporation. Our report will be out very soon. You can look at it on our website. And we are finding some extraordinary things. One of the things we did was, after COVID, children from the fisher community were having extraordinary difficulty with language and science and other things because they did not have access to education, and the Panchayat of Urur Alcott Kuppam, which is said, approached us and said, can you work with the children? What we did was we made their home beach, the coast, a rich living learning space. The curriculum was coastal biodiversity, winds, tides, currents, artisanal practices. And when they went back to school, they were writing in English and Tamil. And the thing was, nature was able to, unleash this thing called intrinsic motivation, the drive to learn. Because when it's your home beach, you will do what it takes to learn that, And that sense of, things like curiosity, things like feeling belonging to, are powerful drivers of literacy and learning. Biodiversity is also a political science teacher. When a child is, and this is something, we work with a bunch of schools, and later humanity teachers come and tell us is that when children are introduced to biodiversity at a young age, they are open to all forms of otherness. The otherness, the difference of another human being is easily befriended rather than seen as separate and distant. And early exposure to biodiversity is able to powerfully do it is something we've been seeing year on year. So, yeah, broadly.
This is also a book about being vulnerable, both obviously the ecosystems being vulnerable in this thing, but also your own life. There's a great deal of autobiography in this book, some of which actually, I was talking to Sophia just now, it made us cry. There's such a lot of, a childhood of violence and all of that. And you've managed to weave it in a way that nature becomes a healing space for that, to get over that trauma. Could you talk about it? And what was it like all these years later, writing about it? Was it cathartic? Was it difficult? I mean, could you talk about that?
I think we make meaning of the world through portals other people and also other beings create for us. Carl Jung has this beautiful book. He didn't write it. His assistant wrote it. Meredith Sabini. It was, he's talking about how access into our own mind and in its different rooms of darkness is actually allowed by other beings. He speaks about. He looks at things like scarab beetles and spiders and birds, trees. Our language derived from other beings. So I'm saying this because in the process of transforming one's personal suffering, this becomes very apparent, very clear. I was, for about 5-6 years, I was under very strong physical abuse from a stepdad, and like very strong, like gory injuries and stuff like that. And then at 16, I actually ran away from home, and I went to my school's director, Gautama, and I told him, listen, I've run away from home. I'm going to go to a hill or a forest, okay? I've just come to take advice from you, yeah? I'm going to do this. Sounds stupid, but I'm not going back home, yeah? He said he had started another campus called Patashala, where it's a residential campus in the watershed of the Palar River Basin. He said, why don't you come there? So he spoke to my mom, made sure all the legalities are in place and whatever. And then he brought me in there, and what I used to face, and this bit is in the prologue and not in the book, extraordinary what people call, post-traumatic stress disorder, that I wouldn't be able to sleep because every day for months together there would be nightmares. And then the strongest healing force was time spent in the more than human world. Because what happens there is a quality of being and of attention where your conventional sense of selfhood, when you think of myself, what comes to your mind? Your history, what you've been through, your work, just think about what comes to your mind when you say myself. And then being in a space where, in a multi-species space, multi-being space, that selfhood becomes porous, sometimes vanishes. So you enter a larger selfhood, which is then able to bring an entirely new light to one's suffering. And it's very clear that when your selfhood is shrunk, I think capitalism tries to do that. It makes our selfhood it hyper individualizes us. Siddhartha Mukherjee wrote about this beautifully. A cancer in the body is a cell with a sense of self as separate from the body. And as such, I think capitalism pushes us into this, I'm separate. I'm this person called Yuvan, whatever. And then an ecology completely shatters that. And I explore that as an extraordinary and perhaps the most primal source of transforming suffering. Yeah.
Please talk about the detrivorous.
Yeah.
Because that was a great.
Yeah. And, it comes back to portals of meaning making. Lot of insects enable us to be able to eat and live and make this thin layer of topsoil. And among them is detritivores. Detritivores are insects and invertebrates and other small organisms like earthworms and dung beetles, millipedes. They turn leaf litter and fecal matter and twigs and sticks back into soil. As it were, they turn the shit of life into something fertile. And for me, that was a very powerful metaphor during that phase, because what would it mean then to be a detritivore into one's own mind, where there is stuckness, siltation, suffering, and to be able to turn that into something fertile, something of growth. What would that mean? That's a line of inquiry in one chapter. Yeah.
Again, insects. There are a lot of insects in your book. And we chatted about it. We chatted about how, charismatic megafauna often takes over the conservation narrative. But Yuvan's looking, I don't know how many insects have you mentioned in the book. They're like 20 varieties of bees itself. I mean, could you talk about that obsession with insects? I'm very curious.
See, when you start to understand an ecology, you start looking at the utter indispensability of small invisible beings. When one engages on the surface, tigers are important. Panthers and hornbills are extremely important. But I think the language ecologies speak through is through small beinghoods. And they are vanishing very fast. And the utter entanglement of our lives is with them. For instance, you take solitary bees. Anything from tur dal to moong dal to various forms of protein comes from not honeybees but solitary bees, the carpenter bees, sweat bees, small emerald bees, reed bees. They're all over. I think A3 is doing some wonderful work selling bee hotels, which you can keep in your houses. They have to sit on flowers. Let's say you take a tur dal flower. It has to sit on a flower. Its pollen is not available for pollination. It has to sit on it and buzz. And for that frequency, the pollen is ejected. And then the bee actually collects that pollen, goes to a leaf, ends up pollinating other flowers, but then also takes the pollen back into its little burrow where multiple bee sisters live, has a bakery, bakes a pollen cake, cuts it into slices, gives it to its larvae. So if not for buzz pollination, a lot of our food is gone. If not for, guess what pollinates custard apple? And there are ant-pollinated plants. The evolution of large, fleshy, tasty flowers came because of beetle pollination. So all your champaka, what do you say in Kannada? Champak, okay. Champak is beetle pollinated. The champak, in fact, does a cunning thing. It opens, it makes sure it releases its smell around dusk. Beetle comes in and then it closes the beetle inside. So then beetle is hanging around, eating stuff. You take, for instance, Ipomia species. Blister beetles come and eat and pollinate. So petals are made as beetle feed. You take custard apples, they're very sturdy petals made for beetles to sit on and mate. Two big beetles can sit on and mate. And it's just that so much of our blood and beinghood comes from these insects. I'm visiting the Karya tribe later in Simlipal Tiger Reserve, who fought a battle against getting Simlipal declared as a tiger reserve. They said, listen, this is not how you determine the health of an ecology, not from the predator, but the pollinator. Don't look at the tiger, taste the honey, you'll know what the forest is like. Yeah.
Kind of taking off from that, a lot of the work you do is with communities who live very closely with, nature and the natural world. And sometimes, as you pointed out, there's this conflict between the community and these larger, conservation narratives. So I wondered if you could talk about the work you do with communities, with the fishing community, where you talked about that fish, which the guy says. So at one point, he's talking to a fisherman, and he says, "Why do we need two names for this fish? It's the same thing." He says something along those lines. Could you talk about that, the knowledge embedded in these systems? We don't use the word indigenous, but communities who live off.
In my mind, I try to differentiate between inhabiting a landscape and exhabiting. In inhabitation, you never use the word resource. Resource purely means you go there to extract. You look at processes, you look at reciprocities, and a lot of the experiences in this book come from learning from fighting with fisher communities, or also Irula folk, and one of the things which comes up from them is their sense of selfhood again. Recently an unfortunate thing happened in Orissa, where a very long fought and won battle for the Niyamgiri hills by the Dongria Kond tribals against the mining giant Vedanta was reverted. Mining rights were given again. And one of their leaders, Lado Sikaka, I've heard him speak, and he said, what is this mountain? What is this people? There is no mountain in people. There is just mountain, and we are that. I remember, recently, the Maori, not recently, a few years ago, Maori released a river constitution for the Wanganui River. And they said that we are not fighting for the river, we are the river fighting itself. And that's a very powerful thing to say. We are manifestations of hydrology. Our deepest identity is a nearby wetland. And just what that means to have a identity and selfhood as a manifestation of hydrology. That was something I drew from a lot from fisher folk. For instance, one of my big teachers is Pale Manna from Urur Kuppam. And he would say something like, 34 years ago, when I took my Katamaram into the ocean, the wind was blowing from the southwest. I don't know what the wind was blowing. I mean, I can feel it now, but there's an animo memory, the complete attunement to, there is no binary between organism and environment in that lived experience. He has a philosophy of contentment. He has a way of fishing for flying fish, where he takes a plant called, he calls it kola chedi, but it's Tephrosia purpurea, and then he makes it rot, and then he leaves it in the water, and then flying fish come and go into a trance-like state, and they are tripping. And then he begins picking up flying fish, and I say, when you're picking up flying fish from the water, you have to observe yourself. And then there's a point where you feel you want more. At that point, you have to stop. Okay? So while picking up flying fish, you need to observe yourself. These are practices of inhabitation. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to read this line. I really like this particular line. I saw another Symbiogenesis remaking the world right around me, silently transfiguring the human-made world brick by brick every day. Can you talk about this idea of symbiogenesis? Can you expand on this thought? What is this new world that you see really?
Yeah. Symbiogenesis is a word coined by, I think a lot of local people knew about it for thousands of years, but Lynn Margulis, who's also the partner of astronomer Carl Sagan, she coined this word. One of the things which baffled Darwin was there are certain parts of evolution where usually evolution happens by this random chance, slowly things are happening. There are specific fossil records where within 1 million years, something has taken over the globe or completely changed, the world's surface. It has happened multiple times, and he got baffled. He wrote to botanist Joseph Hooker saying, "Hey, listen, I think creationism is at play here. I don't think evolution happened here." But then Lynn Margulis looked at it and said, actually, evolution happens when true directional, intentional, massive leaps of evolution happens in the most significant ways through this thing called symbiogenesis, which is basically making friendships. Sometime in history, two utterly different organisms say, you know what, let's live together. Do you know there's a bacteria living in each of our cells? I'm sure a lot of biologists are here, so I'm going to sound stupid a bit. Okay. The mitochondria in our cell is bacteria, is a prokaryotic cell. And when eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells said, let's live together, world transformed. Suddenly, species could do all kinds of things. Similarly, a chloroplast in a plant, which helps a plant photosynthesize, is a bacterial cell. Gymnosperm, that is, the earliest kinds of plants, they befriended fungi, and they formed these internet networks, which forester Susan Simard has written about in her book In Search of the Mother Tree. Forms this sort of brain-like thing under the forest where she can show what is a brain. Brain is a complex system, and she maps the forest as equally, if not more complex. So a forest as a single being is something she has scientifically shown. That's a friendship between plant and fungi. And similarly, that has happened so many times, between flowering plant and pollinator. Within 2 million years, flowering plants have taken over the world. No, not in the colonial sense, but they've spread across, and they've found a way to thrive. And really, evolution is this thing of not one-upmanship, not things trying to compete and fight each other and kill each other, but saying, hey, let's collaborate. And that is when these real leaps of evolution took place. And yeah, that's what symbiogenesis is. Yeah.
So we're going to end with one more reading, which sort of actually takes off from this idea that Yuvan just spoke about.
Okay. Now, there was one kind of friendship which happened a long time ago in the oceans, which increased life in the oceans by about 1,000 times. And they are the most biodiverse places on the earth right now, bleaching and dying because of the heat wave, across India, in Andamans, in the Pak Bay, in Lakshadweep, in Gulf of Kutch and Kambat, across the coast. Corals, they are one of the most fascinating friendships between polyp, which is a kind of a small jellyfish, and zooxanthellae, which is basically a kind of bacterial cell. Coral can both eat, and it can also do photosynthesis, have colors, do all kinds of things. Yeah, so I'm going to read about them. Corals, this friendship does not mean just corals, but all kinds of other organisms this specific friendship creates. So, coral reefs, sea anemones, sea fans, and other marine creatures are living architectures of friendship. Common to them all are zooxanthellae, alchemical single-celled photosynthetic plankton. They form friendships with polyps, anemones, sea slugs, clams, sponges, and flatworms. They build coral reefs, complex structures of deep symbiosis, which have the highest biodiversity of any ecosystem on Earth. In the most uncertain of places, on rock stretches under constant flux and hardship, communities of life thrive through friendships forged by zooxanthellae. They challenge theories that propose competition and one-upmanship as the key to survival. They flout those rules. Competition makes sense only when we consider the unit of evolution to be the individual. When the focus shifts to the level of a group, cooperation is a better model, not only for surviving, but thriving. What might a choral society be like in the human world? Is that a meaningful metaphor for us, or is it too much zoomorphism? What might a zooxanthalate politics be like? Beings which know cell deep that all flourishing is mutual. Who is to say what the self is? Asks Coral, asks Anemone. Who is to define its edges? Looking at and learning from these beings permeates and perforates one's own selfhood and lets one enter life's shore-like porosity.
Should we open for questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. There's been a lot of reports about loss of bee population because of modern technology, cell phone signals and all that. Can you just throw some light on that?
The way we perceive the world defines how we also construct it. And other beings perceive the world differently. And for instance, you take dragonflies. We have 3 pigments in our eyes, which allows us to see maybe 7 colors in a rainbow. Dragonfly has between 12 and 30 pigments. It can see about 1 trillion colors within the rainbow and vastly above and below it. Bees use, they can perceive the magnetic fields of the earth. Birds can too, and that's through something extraordinary. If you can just, Google quantum biology, you'll read about it. There's a complex phenomenon which we have, as humans, discovered only about 100 years ago called quantum entanglement, which is like, you put 2, let's say, subatomic particles in a similar system, let them entangle, and then you separate them, let's say even light years apart. If you change parameters on one, instantaneously the other changes. It's complex stuff, but then the bee actually sees the Earth's magnetic field through that. It has what are called cytochromes in its eyes, which quantum entangle with the magnetic field, and it can perceive what we need, like massive hadron colliders, to discover. So. Other beings perceive the world differently. Their world views, world sights, world smells are different. And what is happening to them is that radio waves, which sometimes can interfere with the Earth's magnetic field, can utterly disorient them. They don't know where they came and where they went. But I think more than that, more than anything, bees, when we talk about bees, I'm talking mostly about solitary bees. India has about 4 species of honey bees. It has almost 800 solitary bees, and they do most of the work. And the problem is of habitat loss, problem is of use of pesticide, use of GM crops, for instance. Recently, Bayer has been pushing GM mustard into India, along with the current government, which is lethal to bees. And they, in fact, kill buzz-pollinating bees, which would wipe out our tur dal, wipe out all kinds of sources of nutrition for us. But then Bayer says, has invented a technology called veggie bee, which is like a little electric toothbrush. You have to hold it from flower to flower like this, and it buzzes. And I say, don't worry, if you don't have bees, you have this toothbrush. It does something like 5% of it. And just imagine doing this work, going from flower to flower. It doesn't work. There's a very common flower in Bangalore called the Hibantthus. Hibantthus ineospermous, Oridal Tamare in Tamil we call. Pollinated only by the small emerald bee, Seratina. No other frequency of buzzing. So I think these are like larger, issues. Of course, radio waves are an issue, but habitat loss and pollution of all kinds, that's understandable. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Yuvan. I think reading this book was like taking a long walk with an old friend, and it really just filled my whole being with so much nourishment. I think I have two questions. One, I'm curious to know more about your writing process, because there is this common perception or misperception that a writer is just locked in a room, but this feels like, like the space between meditation, walking, writing, all of those practices are not distinct. So I'm curious to know like how you wrote the book. And the second question was there any point during the book, during the writing process, where you felt like language really had a limit? You couldn't capture an experience that was so deeply moving and shifting within you. So I'm curious about those two.
Thank you. The first question really gets to the heart of a process I think I tried to consciously follow during the book. I tried to call the writing co-authorship, where I'm trying to let direct engagement, it could be action, it could be observation, to feed the heart of the writing. And in that quality of attention, when there's complete attention, there is no observer in the observed. There is just observation. And I have made an effort to write from that space where there is no self and other, human and nature and so on. And of course, I've read a whole bunch, but then this was the heart of it. The second question is, a lot of places it was important to invent new metaphors, adjectivize a verb, verbize an adjective, violate some rules of language. And I also noticed I've used a lot of Tamil phrases, Tamil words, which languages are birthed by landscapes, and often, and you see this in all landscapes, and it's often easier and more richer to capture these with the native children of which are languages of those landscapes. So I have used those phrases, and there are places where I have tried to not confine by description, but try and draw a dotted line and leave it. But in the process, I did discover that English just lacks so much. The Andaman tribes, which one Mr. White, an Englishman, has documented, have so many words for ripples. And because they have different words for ripples, they can actually see those ripples. 4 days before the tsunami came, they went upon Mount Harriet and other high places. And they're telling the ocean is angry with us, we need to move inland. And people are like, mad guys. But then next they just got, pounded later. And so different forms of language allow different forms of seeing too, yeah.
Okay. I just want to ask how JK's philosophy fundamentally influenced you. So when I heard you talk about self-consciousness, binary, I thought of JK, but then he told me you studied there. And also, when I go through such kind of philosophy, I mean, intellectually we can understand that, but experientially it is so hard to realize that. So how do you do that?
So yeah, J.K. Rowling did, no, I'm joking. J. Krishnamurti did influence. I studied in, although you find a lot of Harry Potter references in that. Yeah. I studied in a Krishnamurti school where, it was a forest in the middle of a campus. And although home was a very tumultuous, often unsafe space, the school was a complete haven, and the grounding philosophy of be a light unto yourself, question every answer. When you're hurting nature, you're hurting yourself. These are things I heard and was part of, or at least participant of conversations from a very young age, and I think that brought about certain portals of seeing and thinking, which in fact I can't even describe, certain forms of inquiry which was seeded very young. So it was, I'm just grateful to have grown in that space, and also later having briefly taught in that space too. Yeah.
And I had read an article which said that one of the largest thefts of mangrove forests took place in Bombay around Thane Creek during 2611, and all the media and the police were involved at the goings on at South Bombay. So, what's the attraction of mangrove? Is it the tree that attracts these smugglers, or what is the attraction for smugglers?
Attraction for smugglers.
Why do they cut the mangrove?
Why do they smuggle mangroves? Okay, so this is a specific example I don't have knowledge of in the Thane Creek. What I know about and what I've written about mangroves is that they actually build coasts. Multiple mangroves have, so if you take the Rhizophora mangrove, it has stilt roots. The Avicennia mangrove has pneumatophores coming out like a bed of arrows around, and those arrows actually sort of trap, organic matter. Seeds form, new mangroves form. So they're actually sort of architects of coasts. Anybody's been to Thillai Natarajar temple, Chidambaram in Tamil Nadu? Yes, okay. Thillai is actually a mangrove's name, Exicaria agaloka. And the Chidambara Ragasyam inside is made up of Thillai mangrove, which can never rot. And the dance of Shiva is supposed to personify the dance of that mangrove. And him, in some stories, him stepping and the sea going back is the coastal buffer mangrove builds. That is to the extent I know, but there could be reasons why people are smuggling mangroves, which I'm afraid I'm not knowledgeable enough of, to answer. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Just two quick questions. I might sound like a complete fool asking them, but see what you can make of it. Since you observed bees and insects so much, do they, once you're very familiar with them, do they begin speaking back to you? One. And the second question is, are bees and insects also individualistic? Can they say, I'm not going to go with my community? I'm coming back to the question of the self. How do you respond to both these questions?
I think it's an excellent question because we have our very rigid constructs of what speaking and interacting means. If one can question that, then worlds open up. In that sense, I would say yes to the first question. They can speak a whole lot. I've forgotten who said it. What is missing is not voices but ears. Yeah. I've forgotten your second question. Yeah. I'm currently writing a lot. I'm actually writing a book about insects and about Indian insects in different geographies. And one of the things which comes up in insects is they absolutely question the construct of self. You look at ants, for instance. There's a yellow crazy ant which is extraordinarily invasive in Dindigul of Tamil Nadu, but also a lot of other, even in Bangalore. And they form super colonies. So the fact is that over several tens of square kilometers, there are multiple nests, and there are ants which are working simultaneously for multiple nests. There are multiple queens. Their sense of identity and selfhood is spread across all of this, and it's forming super colonies, and they don't show, the usual construct. So this is actually making them very, very good at just ravaging ecosystems. So, the conventional constructs of individuality, actually, other organisms, if you look at them, they start dismantling. And you find that even we ourselves, there's an interesting binary. What is singular and what is plural? You look at yourself, one can perceive oneself as a community of cellular and microbial entities choosing to work together, or maybe in some people not choosing to work together very well. That is plural, but I can also look at myself as singular, and I'm part of multiple selfhoods. I think that is how other beings speak to us.
Should talk about Drosophila and loneliness. The fruit flies and loneliness.
Yeah. I mean, there's one passage which just takes off from the fact that fruit flies, which if you keep a rotten fruit on your table, the little column of flies, they actually can feel lonely. If you isolate them, they stop feeding, and they just starve to death. And you need to, or if you put them in a new colony, they're like feeling socially isolated. And yeah.
I think we can take one last question and then we'll wrap up.
I read an interesting article that somewhere in France, the bees were producing colored honey and flavored honey. So it was traced to a nearby M&M factory where the discarded syrup, the bees doing a shortcut, instead of going to the flowers for nectar, they were producing honey from the discarded syrup. So is that good or bad in the long run?
I almost want to say no comments, but I have seen a different version of this. Is that after birthday parties and a paper, this colored paper you use in birthday parties, they're like very wrinkly and you sort of hang from the it's paper. And if there are a lot of paper wasps, what they do is they go to that paper and then suddenly you find rainbow colored nests. A lot of species are learning to navigate human built ecosystems, just like the banyan. In fact, there are species which are entirely what we call synanthropic. They are made to live. For instance, I can tell you species of ants. Black longhorn crazy ant, Paratrechina, which is like the Pulayar everywhere. It can only live in human spaces. The destructor ant. You look at, for instance, the mud dauber wasp, Chalabion bengalans. It takes cement, it actually scratches distemper from walls and uses it for nesting. So I think it's an example of animals adapting some, but is that a good thing? I don't know, but it's happening. Are they liking? No, they are being creative. They are pushed to reimagine how they live, and yeah.
Thank you, Yuvan and Preeti, for an engaging session.